My name is Rachel Hobbs, and I will be giving a commentary on the first 30 or so lines of Gwedolyn Brooks's poem, A Bronzeville Mother Loiters in Mississippi. Meanwhile, a Mississippi mother burns bacon. So to start this poem, or this commentary, I would like to first give a bit of background knowledge about this poem. This poem from Gwedolyn Brooks's Bean Eaters collection, which was published in the 1960s, or in 1960, was about, most specifically, the story of Emmett Till. And for those of you who don't know, the story of Emmett Till is basically, he was the start of the civil rights movement in America. And it's the story about how a 14-year-old boy from Chicago went to Mississippi to visit his family. He whistled at a white woman while he was in a supermarket. This woman told her husband about what happened, and so her husband, being the kind, gentle, loving husband that he was, went out and promptly killed Emmett Till. He beat him to death so badly that his own mother could barely recognize him. And this, for many reasons, outraged a lot of people, not only because he was 14, but he was from Chicago, and now the Northerners found out how terrible the South was and how racist everyone was. And so that is truly what started the civil rights movement. So my interpretation of this poem was written from the voice of Carolyn Bryant, who is the lady that Emmett Till whistled at in the supermarket. And the reason that Gwedolyn Brooks wrote this poem in the voice of Carolyn Bryant is because she wanted to give Carolyn Bryant a chance to tell her story. She wanted to give Carolyn Bryant a voice, and she wanted to humanize her and get people to sympathize with her, at least a little bit. And she does this throughout the poem by using tonal shifts, metaphors, and diction. So to start, the tone for the first two stanzas is it gives the connotation a lot of fairy tales and ballads are always give the connotation of either romance or songs or narratives, and so it's a story. She's telling a story, is what Gwedolyn Brooks is trying to get at, is that Carolyn Bryant's telling this story, this elaborate tale of the dark villain and the fine prince and her happy ever after. And so it's really giving this fairy tale like tone from the very beginning, to give you a sense of fantasy, to give the reader a sense of what might be going through Carolyn Bryant's head. And then instantly in the third stanza, the tone shifts with her bacon burned. This line really gives us a sense of urgency, a sense of instantly the reader's thrown into Carolyn Bryant's life, and suddenly we are in her kitchen and the bacon is burning, and suddenly Carolyn Bryant is pulled back into reality and she's focused on her bacon burning. And it's really the first look that the reader gets into Carolyn Bryant's home life and what it's like to live in her house, which I'll get into a little bit later, and the sense of normalcy that she's trying to convey with her food and the sour milk biscuits and the new quince preserve. But I'll get into that later. And so then the second shift that happens directly after the third stanza with the word but, which Gwedolyn Brooks is known for using the word but to convey tonal shifts. And so then this instantly brings us back to just that, the matter of the dark villain. And it brings us back to the fairy tale. It brings us back to the story, and thus again giving the reader the connotation that Carolyn Bryant is a human, and if not even more so, a bit more of a child, and that while she's trying to process this, she's trying to process this any way she can, which is with fairy tales, and trying to explain it through a story that it's a lot easier to understand. And so she's trying to get the reader to sympathize with Carolyn Bryant through the tone of a story, a fairy tale. To talk more about the metaphors of the dark villain and the fine prince, the dark villain obviously being Emmett Till, as he is referred to later as a blackish child of 14. So, obviously, the dark villain is Emmett Till, and the Fine Prince being her husband, as she's rescued by the Fine Prince. And the other metaphor I would like to call attention to is the ballads they had set her to in school. Now, this is the metaphor that is really setting the tone for the story, I feel, because the ballads they set her to in school, that's what Gwendolyn Brooks is trying to tell you, is trying to tell the reader, is she's really trying to convey that this is what this is what Carolyn Bryant has been taught her whole life, her in school, is that the black people are bad, the Negroes are the lesser race, and that she's always been taught in school the stories of love and romance, and that you should always love the man in your house, whether that being your father or your husband. And, growing up in the 1950s as a white woman, she was always been taught to love her husband, get married, have kids, do the whole, shebang of being a housewife. And that's what she's been taught. That's all Carolyn Bryant knows is loving the patriarch of her family, basically. And that's what Gwendolyn Brooks is really trying to convey with these metaphors of the Fine Prince, who has never done anything wrong in his life, and the dark villain who, of only 14, managed to be, well, just that, a villain. And so with the metaphor of the ballads, Gwendolyn Brooks is really trying to call attention to the fact that this is what Carolyn Bryant knows to be true, and this is all she's ever been taught. Furthermore, with the diction of the poem, the diction is really childish and fairy tale like, with the words of such as the dark villain and the Fine Prince and knights and princesses. It's all very childish. And then even more so when she says the words, the hacking down of a villain was more fun to think about in the fourth stanza. She's really calling attention to these connotations of the words villain and prince, the contrast between heroes and villains. But then it completely changes, because then in the last stanza, the fifth stanza, she's really saying the dark villain was a blackish child of 14. And now Gwendolyn Brooks is finally pulling in the other factor, that the villain, yes, while being that he was a villain, he was a child. He was still a child. He was still too young to be dirty. He was still too young to have lost every reminder of his infant softness. It's really giving us, with the juxtaposition of villain and child and the conflict between those two words, Gwendolyn Brooks is trying to show the conflict that Carolyn Bryant feels between, is he a villain, but he's also a child, but he's also a villain, but he's also a child. And it's really giving that conflict that Carolyn Bryant must be feeling, and it's really giving us a sense giving the reader a sense to sympathize with her, to sympathize with this conflict that she's feeling about the villain and the child, about how is it black or white? Is it one or the other? Is it infant softness, or is it the whose history is cluttered with the bones of eaten knights and princesses? It's all very conflicted and confused. So in conclusion, this style, while this style is free verse, it has no formal structure. It's not like a lot of Gwendolyn Brooks's other poems. There is one major thing that she's doing here, that she does do in a lot of her poems, which is like, for example, her poem The Mother from A Street in Bronzeville collection. She uses the poem The Mother not to give her opinion on abortions, but to give the mothers who have had abortions a voice. That's all she's doing, is giving them a voice. She's not conveying an opinion. She's just giving them room to talk. And that's what she's doing in this poem. She's giving Carolyn Bryant room to talk. She's giving Carolyn Bryant a voice, an undisputed voice. That's all she's doing. And that's the main similarity connotation that I feel when I read this poem, is that she's giving a voice to the voiceless, more so. And so that really, most people would think that the theme of this poem would be to, hear both sides of this story. But for me, I think that the theme of this poem is that it's hardest, it's hard to look for the best in people. And it's human nature to look for the worst in people. So, yeah, that's it. And I'm 2 minutes over. Great. Okay.